Life under wartime government control. With the beginning of the Sino-Japanese War, the whole country agreed to cooperate with the war, and in 1938 it began a movement for spiritual mobilization of citizens. A sense of patriotism was raised in every area of life, such as education, events, physical education, and entertainment, was centered on war. After 1939, one day in a month was designated as Asia Development Public Service Day, which meant that on that day, meal consisted of a modest miso soup, rice with one side dish, such as the box lunch with a pickled plum in the center of the rice. People refer to this boxed lunch as the rising sun boxed lunch. Like the sun in the Japanese flag, the red plum is centered against the white rice. The aim of this event was to turn one's thought to the hardship of the soldiers in the battlefield and to live plainly as they did. The government began to collect metals from the public to build battleships and weapons, and made many rules to withdraw mailboxes, benches, and so on, which were made of metal. The iron and copper from gates and billboards of factories and shops were collected as well as temple bells. During this time, the country was facing a food shortage. Imports from overseas decreased due to war, and as many of the men who were growing crops had to leave for war, the women and children who were left behind were not able to reap a satisfactory harvest. In order to solve the problem, rice was conserved and people were encouraged to skip meals. Still, the food shortage was serious and a rationing system was introduced. Furthermore, as the government encouraged the cultivation of crops in vacant areas, people grew potatoes and pumpkins in parks, sports grounds, and empty areas of factories to stave off their hunger.
Once all-out war had been launched in China, full cooperation with the war effort was demanded of every Japanese. Ordinary citizens were forced to lead an increasingly frugal lifestyle and wear the kind of citizens' uniforms modeled by the mannequins in the corner. The sale of goods was restricted, and such staples as miso, salt, vegetables, and fish were rationed. Moreover, since taxes alone were insufficient to finance the war, pressure was put on people to buy war bonds and to save as much money as possible so that it could be used for the war effort. The first part of this section of the museum displays war bonds and savings banks to illustrate the harsh economic realities of those days. The government also desperately needed metal to make weapons, so it established a system called kenno for people to donate metal to send weapons to the troops. Although the term kenno implies donation, in actuality, anything made of metal was confiscated by the government for use in weapons production. Wood or ceramic implements and parts, such as the ceramic iron and many other ceramic utensils shown in the glass display case, replaced metal utensils in the home. Companies and laborers were also brought together in the Industrial Patriots movement to ensure their support for the war. Labor unions were banned. Women were mobilized into the Women's Volunteer Corps to work in munitions factories. In addition, all forms of media, including music, movies, and newspapers, were transformed into instruments of war propaganda, as suggested by the displays here. Even the record you see here contains a patriotic song. Militarism tainted even children's play, as can be seen by the photos and toys displayed here. One child's drawing on display here shows enemies being sprayed and swatted like flies. A photograph also shows children being trained to beat portraits of U.S. President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill with sticks. Later in the war, children's lives were affected even more. As the danger of air raids increased, buildings were thinned out to minimize the spread of fire, and since it was thought that children would only hamper air defense measures, they were evacuated to the countryside.
This section describes the relationship between the military and society at large.
Both the military and the war effort relied on the support of society. The picture postcards in the case were created to give deployed soldiers information on conditions at home. The sash in the case on the right is from the Women's National Defense Association, while the miniature Japanese flag is from the Patriotic Women's Association. Both organizations served as important roles in seeing soldiers off to war. The bag in the case, even further to the right, is a soldier's comfort bag. It was used to send various items to a deployed soldier.
Home front preparations and air raids. In 1942, on 18th April, the first air raids on the Japanese mainland took place. The cities that were damaged were Tokyo, Kawasaki, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Yokkaichi, Kobe, and others. The air raids became harsher by the day. People dug holes in the ground to build air raid shelters to protect themselves from bombs and incendiary bombs that were dropped by enemy planes. Apart from air raid shelters that were made for homes, collective shelters were made in schools, offices, parks, and roadsides. Fire started from houses and shops, which were caused by the air raids. And in order not to let fire spread to public offices, military buildings, factories, and railway stations, the neighborhood houses and shops were destroyed or removed. From December 1944 towards the end of the war, the air raids worsened, and the numbers of deaths approached nearly 470,000 people, and the numbers of damaged buildings reached about 2,280,000. In order to prepare for the air raids, government and ordinary people had fire prevention training, shelter training, and simulation training on a daily basis, but they were not effective. Foreseeing the night air raids, the lights in homes, factories, and shops were covered, and the curtains were drawn.
Even after the tide of war turned against Japan in Asia and the Pacific region, and its major cities had been reduced to charred ruins, the war continued. The military government was determined to protect the imperial system and delayed the decision to end the war, with disastrous results. On August 6, 1945, the newly developed uranium bomb was dropped by American forces on Hiroshima. On August 9th, the U.S. dropped a plutonium bomb on Nagasaki. In that year alone, approximately 200,000 people died in those two cities as a direct result of the atomic bombs. In later years, the after effects of the radiation, such as leukemia and other forms of cancer, claimed the lives of approximately another 100,000 people. The United States claimed to have dropped the bombs to expedite Japan's surrender and reduce the number of American casualties. At the same time, however, the U.S. wished to end the war before the Soviet Union could join in, thus ensuring that America would gain sole control of the occupied territories. The dropping of the atomic bombs therefore effectively became the first act of the Cold War, which pitted the United States against the Soviet Union after World War II. The displays in this section of the museum contain many artifacts and fragments that remained after the atomic bombing of these two Japanese cities. A set of 2 postcards written just before the bombing of Hiroshima are included in the exhibit.
In 1945, on August 6th in Hiroshima and again on August 9th in Nagasaki, atomic bombs were used in war for the first time in human history. Every one of the clocks here is stopped at the time the bombs hit. The panel on the right traces the American history of the atomic bomb, from its development to its deployment. As you can see, the U.S. newspaper reports that an atomic bomb has been dropped on Hiroshima, and its headline announces that an entire city has vanished. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki immediately ended the lives of countless people, but there were also countless others who survived and continued to suffer. The panel at the center shows pictures of Hiroshima immediately after the bombing and a video of bomb victims suffering its after effects. The Japanese anti-nuclear movement that has emerged since the war is deeply rooted in the experiences of the bomb victims. The panel on the left shows developments around the world and in Japan following the bombings.